In a hotel room outside Cancun on the afternoon of April 14, 2018, a 54-year-old man is found dead. His name is Matthew Mellon. He was due to enter an experimental drug treatment program the next morning. On his laptop is a cryptocurrency wallet whose keys are about to be lost. I've come back to this part of the story many times. The hotel room is not the strange part. The wallet is. Matthew Mellon was an heir to one of the oldest banking dynasties in the United States. In the years before he died, he had invested approximately $2 million in a cryptocurrency called XRP. At its peak in early January of 2018, the holding was reportedly worth more than $1 billion. He never sold it. He could not, in the end, fully access it. Most of it would die with him. In 1870, two brothers opened a private bank in Pittsburgh. By the end of the century, it was the largest outside New York. In 1871, that same bank made a $10,000 loan to a 21-year-old named Henry Clay Frick. The loan would become a 40-year partnership. In 1930 and 1931, the sitting Secretary of the Treasury of the United States secretly bought 21 paintings from Stalin's Soviet government for $6.5 million. They became the founding collection of the National Gallery of Art. On January 6, 1932, a Texas congressman walked onto the floor of the House of Representatives and delivered the formal words of impeachment against the same Treasury Secretary. In 1957, Fortune magazine identified the 8 wealthiest Americans alive. 4 of them were first cousins. They all had the same surname. In 1962, one of those cousins was asked by President Kennedy to redesign the White House Rose Garden. At 96, she would transfer more than $700,000 to cover up a presidential candidate's affair. In October of 2025, an heir to the same family wrote a check for $130 million, anonymously, to pay United States troops during a federal government shutdown. Matthew Mellon was an heir to all of it. These facts are documented. They are not the strangest part of the story. This is the story of the family that financed American industry across 5 generations, sat in the cabinet of 3 United States presidents, and built the National Gallery of Art. It is also the story of the great-great-grandson who turned $2 million into $1 billion, died in a Cancun hotel room, and left the keys to his fortune in a place no one could find them. I want to start in the hotel room. That is where Matthew Mellon was on the afternoon of April 14th, when the housekeeping staff opened the door. Chapter 1. The hotel room. The hotel sat on the Mayan Riviera, south of Cancun, on the strip of resort coastline that runs from the airport down toward Tulum. He had checked in days earlier with his second wife, Nicole Hanley. He was scheduled to enter a clinic the following morning that offered an experimental treatment for opioid dependency using a plant alkaloid called ibogaine. Ibogaine is illegal in the United States. The clinics that administer it operate almost without exception in Mexico. He was found on the morning of April 14, 2018. The cause was a heart attack. He had been using opioids again in the days before his scheduled treatment, against his clinical team's instructions. By the public accounts of the death, the combination of opioid use and the cardiovascular load of his long addiction was the immediate cause. He was 54 years old. What lingers about this scene, on a 3rd or 4th reading of the public material, is what was in the room with him. On his laptop was a digital wallet containing XRP, a cryptocurrency he had begun acquiring in 2014. He had invested approximately $2 million. By early 2018, when XRP briefly reached its peak price, that holding was reportedly worth more than $1 billion. By the day he died, the price had fallen considerably. but the holding was still nominally worth several $100 million. He had told reporters, on the record, in 2 long interviews in the months before he died, that he had not shared the keys to that wallet with anyone. Not with his wife, not with his lawyer, not with the family office. The keys existed only in his head, on his laptop, and on a small number of physical devices in storage units and houses he owned in New York and London. After his death, the estate could not find most of them. The Internal Revenue Service, which does not care whether assets are accessible, taxed the estate on the value of the holding at the time of death. The deficiency notice was for $36 million. The estate spent years trying to recover the keys, liquidate what could be moved, and meet the obligation. The final recovery, by the best public accounting available through tax court filings, was approximately $150 million. The rest is, by all available evidence, still in the wallet. The keys have not been found. This part of the story needs to be set down clearly before anything else. Matthew Mellon was, by the standards of late capitalism, an extremely wealthy man. He had inherited wealth from a family that had inherited wealth from a family. He had then created additional wealth on top of the inherited wealth in an asset class invented within his own lifetime. And he had stored that additional wealth in a way that depended, finally, on a man with a long-running opioid addiction remembering or recording a sequence of characters. The fortune did not save him. It also did not, in the institutional sense, fully survive him. The story of the Internet's first generation of crypto-millionaires is full of these endings. Lost passphrases, hard drives in landfills, sudden cardiac events at 38 or 46 or 54. The Mellon case sits at the high end of that distribution. But it sits at the high end for another reason. The story would not, in the end, be remembered for the wallet. It would be remembered because the man holding the wallet was the latest member of one of the oldest American banking dynasties on record. The family had financed Gulf Oil and Alcoa. It had sat in the cabinet of 3 United States presidents. It had built the National Gallery of Art. It had, across 5 generations, accumulated and given away and lost and recovered some of the largest pools of private capital ever assembled in the United States. To understand how a man with that much history behind him ended up alone in a Cancun hotel room with the keys to his own fortune lost, you have to go back. Not to the cryptocurrency boom of 2017, not to the founding of Jimmy Choo, not to his father's generation or even his grandfather's. You have to go back to a 5-year-old boy on a ship out of Belfast in 1818, and to the autobiography of an American printer that he would, years later, find on a shelf in a Pennsylvania farmhouse. Chapter 2. Camp Hill Cottage. Camp Hill Cottage is a small stone house in County Tyrone, in what is now Northern Ireland. The roof is thatched. The interior is 2 rooms. In 1818, it was the home of a Scotch-Irish farming family who had been in Ulster for roughly a century. The family was Presbyterian. The family was literate. The family was, by the standards of County Tyrone in 1818, doing approximately as well as any small tenant farming family could expect to do. The grandfather of the household, Archibald Mellon, had sailed for Pennsylvania 2 years earlier to assess whether the family should follow. He returned with a positive verdict and a parcel of Westmoreland County farmland already purchased. In the autumn of 1818, his son Andrew, with Andrew's 5-year-old son Thomas, sailed from Belfast on the same Atlantic crossing that had been carrying their cousins for half a century. They settled on a farm in Westmoreland County, southeast of Pittsburgh. The family economy remained agricultural. Thomas was expected to take the farm. I have spent a long time thinking about what would have happened to American industrial history if Thomas Mellon had taken the farm. What happened instead is that he came across a book. He was, by his own later account in his autobiography of 1885, somewhere around 14 years old when he encountered the autobiography of Benjamin Franklin in the home of a neighbor. He read it in 2 days. He records with the kind of precision that becomes the family's signature the exact effect. That the book made him see, for the first time, that an obscure boy could direct his own life by intention and study. He wrote, decades later, that the discovery was so consequential that he attempted to make Franklin's life a kind of program. He would learn, he would earn, he would court a particular kind of marriage, he would build a particular kind of estate, he would, in time, retire to write his own autobiography and pass the work to his sons. He did all of it. He read law in Pittsburgh. He passed the bar in 1839. He married Sarah Jane Negley in 1843. The Negleys were one of the older landed families of the Pittsburgh region. Thomas had, by his own later account, first encountered the Negley estate as a boy, delivering produce from his father's farm. He had recorded the experience in his autobiography as the moment he first encountered wealth and magnificence of a kind he had previously had no conception of. He married into it. The marriage was, in the language of the period, a good one. It brought Mellon into the legal and commercial network of the city's leading Presbyterian families. He built a downtown law practice. He invested in real estate. He had 8 children with Sarah, of whom 5 would survive to adulthood. The 2 who mattered most for what was about to happen were Andrew, born in 1855, and Richard Beatty, born in 1858. In 1859, Thomas Mellon was appointed assistant judge of the Allegheny County Court of Common Pleas. He held the bench for the next decade. In January of 1870, he opened a private bank at 145 Smithfield Street, Pittsburgh, with his 2 oldest sons informally apprenticed behind the counter. Andrew was 15, Richard was 12. The bank was called Thomas Mellon & Sons. The Panic of 1873 arrived 3 years later. Half of Pittsburgh's organized banks failed. Half of the city's private banks failed. Thomas Mellon & Sons did not. The reason was simple in retrospect and difficult to execute in real time. Thomas had not extended credit on the speculative side of the boom. The bank had not financed railroad bonds it could not value. It had stayed close to industries it could see. When the dust settled, Thomas Mellon & Sons was, by a considerable margin, the strongest private bank in western Pennsylvania. The next decade would see it begin to extend credit to the men who were about to remake the American economy. The bank that opened in January of 1870 would, within 14 months, make a loan that would shape the next half-century of American industry. If you have made it this far, you should probably subscribe. It is free. It is what keeps these going. Chapter 3. The loan. The loan was for $10,000. The date was March of 1871. The borrower was 21 years old. His name was Henry Clay Frick. He had grown up on his grandfather's farm in West Overton, Pennsylvania, about 40 miles southeast of Pittsburgh. The family had a small distillery on the property that produced a rye whiskey under the brand Old Overholt. Frick had finished about 10 months of college and had been working as a bookkeeper. He had a plan to acquire beehive coke ovens in the Connellsville coal region, where the bituminous coal could be transformed by slow combustion into a high-carbon fuel suitable for steel making. Andrew Carnegie was, around the same time, building the steel mills that would consume that coke for the next half-century. Frick had been to the bank twice. The first visit, he had been refused. He had come back with a more detailed proposal and a guarantee from his uncle. The second visit, Thomas Mellon read the proposal, interviewed Frick across what one later biographer described as an uncomfortable length of time, and approved the loan. By the standards of the period, this was an extraordinary risk. The assessment, history would record, was correct. Frick built his coke ovens. Within a year, he was solvent. Within 5 years, he controlled the bulk of the Connellsville coke supply. By 1879, he was Carnegie Steel's most important supplier. By 1889, he was Carnegie's partner and chairman. The Mellons, who would, across the next 2 decades, come to share equity in many of Frick's ventures, profited as Frick rose. But the more important consequence of the 1871 loan was not the equity. It was that Frick became, for the rest of his life, the closest business associate that Andrew Mellon would ever have. Andrew, who would eventually run the family's industrial empire from a Pittsburgh office, would refer to Frick across more than 40 years of correspondence as Mr. Frick. They would travel to Europe together, they would collect art together, they would invest together in dozens of new ventures. I have read enough of the correspondence to be sure of one thing, which is that Andrew Mellon did not have many close friends. He had a brother. He had Frick. The biographer who wrote about him later observed that he was probably never close to anyone, not even the Coke King. The phrase, "the Coke King," referred to Frick. That phrasing tells you something. By the end of his life, Andrew Mellon used the same form of address with his closest associate that he had used at 25. The first joint trip was in 1880. Mellon was 25. Frick had just turned 30. They left Pittsburgh, sailed for Liverpool, and spent that summer touring Britain, France, and Italy. They went to every major museum that would admit them. They walked the galleries of the Louvre. They studied. They began, in a serious way, to collect. What they bought on that first trip would not later be remembered. What they began to understand on that trip would. The Mellon-Frick partnership ran across the 1880s and 90s at increasing scale. Union Trust Company was organized in October of 1889. Union Steel followed and was eventually folded into the new United States Steel Combine. Old Overholt, the family whiskey from West Overton, came under joint ownership when Frick took control of the distillery, and the shares would be passed to Andrew at Frick's death. Frick's life was, in its public dimension, dominated by 2 events. The first was the Homestead Strike of July 1892, when as chairman of Carnegie Steel, he ordered Pinkertons to break a union action at the mills. A gunfight followed on the river. There were deaths on both sides. 2 weeks later, an anarchist named Alexander Berkman entered Frick's office and shot him twice in the neck and stabbed him in the leg. Frick returned to work that afternoon and sent a telegram to Carnegie reading, more or less, that he had been twice shot but not dangerously. The second event was the break with Carnegie that culminated in Frick's 1899 lawsuit and a March 1900 settlement of approximately $30 million in securities. Frick and Carnegie never reconciled. The historian who wrote about the relationship later described it as a breach the 2 men carried to their graves. Andrew Mellon, in this story, was the third party who absorbed everything Frick learned and never publicly contradicted him. He outlived both Carnegie and Frick. He inherited Frick's old Overholt shares when Frick died in 1919. He inherited, in a less material sense, Frick's reading of how American industry would consolidate over the next half-century. The partnership had begun with a $10,000 loan to a 21-year-old. It ran 48 years. Chapter 4. The Gusher. On the morning of January 10, 1901, at a hill called Spindletop near Beaumont, Texas, a drilling rig that had spent months grinding through 1,139 feet of rock and shale produced a column of crude oil that fountained over the derrick. The well, known thereafter as the Lucas Gusher, ran at an estimated 100,000 barrels a day before it could be capped. By some contemporaneous estimates, It produced more oil in 9 days than every other well in Texas had produced the previous year, and enough to triple total United States oil output overnight. The drilling company was J.M. Guffey Petroleum, which had been financed almost entirely by the Mellon brothers in Pittsburgh. By the autumn of 1902, Andrew Mellon and Richard Mellon and a small number of their associates held the majority of the equity. By January of 1907, the holding had been reorganized as the Gulf Oil Corporation, with Andrew Mellon as president and his nephew, William Larimer Mellon Sr., installed as operating chief. Guffey was bought out for approximately $3 million. William Larimer would hold his position for 45 years. Spindletop is the entry point for the Mellon fortune into the second tier of American industry, the part that would not look like banking. Within a decade of Spindletop, the family had financed or absorbed aluminum through a $25,000 loan made in 1889 to a struggling Pittsburgh reduction company that would, by 1907, be renamed the Aluminum Company of America. By the 1920s, Alcoa was producing roughly all of the aluminum used in the United States. Carborundum, an industrial abrasive that proved essential to grinding the harder steels. Standard Steel Car, which built rail cars at a moment when the country was extending track at unprecedented speed. Koppers Gas and Coke Company, acquired in 1914, which gave the family control over the chemistry of coke distillation and its byproducts. The Mellon Institute of Industrial Research, founded in 1913, which would produce the first viable mass-produced ethylene from petroleum, the first gas mask for American troops in the First World War, and the founding research that became Dow Corning. By 1920, Andrew Mellon was a director of more than 60 corporations. The Mellon National Bank, reorganized in 1902 out of the old Thomas Mellon & Sons private partnership, was one of the major banks of the American interior. The scale of what was assembled is easy to miss if you read the names in succession. What Andrew and Richard Mellon had done over the 30 years between 1890 and 1920 was to take a regional Pittsburgh bank and use it to acquire controlling positions in oil, aluminum, banking, industrial chemistry, railcar manufacturing, and industrial research, all coordinated from a single office on Smithfield Street. The closest analogy at the time was John D. Rockefeller's Standard Oil. But Standard Oil was a single industry. The Mellon holdings spanned 6 or 7, none of them obvious in advance. The mechanism was the bank. The bank would extend credit to a small or failing enterprise. The bank would take equity along with the loan. The Mellon brothers would install a family member or a trusted manager. They would let the enterprise grow. They would, over time, end up with a controlling block of stock and a strategic position in another major American industry. The pattern repeated dozens of times. By the standards of the period, this was not, strictly speaking, anti-competitive in a legal sense, because the Mellons rarely consolidated industries the way Rockefeller and Carnegie had. They did not need to. They held controlling positions across multiple unrelated industries, which meant that the federal antitrust machinery, which had been built to break up single industry monopolies, was structurally unable to reach what they had built. The configuration is what mattered. Andrew Mellon had never held public office. He had never appeared on a national magazine cover. He did not give speeches. He did not, by any account, enjoy social life. The phrase his contemporaries used, repeatedly, was that he was a very quiet man. In March of 1921, Warren G. Harding, recently elected on a platform of returning the country to what Harding called normalcy, invited Andrew Mellon to serve as the next Secretary of the Treasury of the United States. Mellon accepted. He was 65 years old. Hit subscribe if you want the next one. Costs nothing. Takes a second. Chapter 5. Treasury. The Treasury Building stands at 15th Street and Pennsylvania Avenue, directly east of the White House. It is a Greek Revival structure of granite. The Secretary's office is on the second floor, with a view that crosses the South Lawn and the Washington Monument. On March 4, 1921, Andrew Mellon took possession of that office, and what followed across the next 11 years has no clean precedent in American political economy. He kept the office through the Harding administration. He kept it through Calvin Coolidge's 2 terms. He kept it through Herbert Hoover's election in 1928 and into Hoover's 3rd year. He served in total under 3 presidents from 2 political eras, with no break in continuity. The journalist William Allen White later said that during the Coolidge years, it was fair to refer to the administration as the reign of Coolidge and Mellon. The policy of the Mellon Treasury, set out across the Revenue Acts of 1921, 1924, and 1926, was straightforward in principle and consequential in effect. The top marginal income tax rate, which had been 73% in 1922, was cut to 24% by 1929. The excess profits tax from the First World War was repealed. The estate tax was reduced. The argument was the one later associated with the economist Arthur Laffer, that very high marginal rates were discouraging investment, suppressing reported income, and producing less revenue than lower rates would. The empirical record from the period is contested but real. Personal income tax revenue rose from approximately $719 million in 1921 to over $1 billion in 1929. The national debt, approximately $24 billion in 1920, had been reduced to approximately $16 billion by 1931. Critics, then and since, argued that the tax cuts fueled the speculative bubble in equities that crashed in October of 1929, and that the bank consolidation Mellon's Treasury permitted made the bank failures of 1931 and 32 unmanageable. I am not going to settle that argument here. Better people have spent careers on it. By the standards of the period, the Mellon Treasury was regarded, on the eve of the 1929 crash, as the most successful treasury in American history. Mellon was being called, by contemporaries on Capitol Hill, the greatest Secretary of the Treasury since Alexander Hamilton. The wire services kept photographs of him on file under that exact caption. Then the crash came. And then something else happened, which is the part of the story I want to put down carefully. While Andrew Mellon was serving as Treasury Secretary in the years 1930 and 1931, he was simultaneously the buyer in a series of secret transactions with the Soviet government for 21 paintings from the Hermitage collection in Leningrad. Stalin's government was, in those years, raising hard currency for industrialization by selling the imperial art collections that had been confiscated from the Russian aristocracy after 1917. The sales went through a small consortium of European dealers, principally the firm Matthiessen in Berlin and Kolnagi in London, in partnership with the Knoedler Gallery in New York. The Soviet side wanted dollars. The Mellon side wanted right of first refusal on the most important paintings. The transactions were extraordinary. Across 2 years, Andrew Mellon paid $6,654,000 for 21 paintings, including the Alba Madonna by Raphael, at $1,166,400, which was at that time the highest price ever paid for a painting. The collection included works by Jan van Eyck, Sandro Botticelli, Titian, Rembrandt van Rijn, Diego Velázquez, and Pietro Perugino. The Treasury Secretary paid for the paintings out of his personal funds. The transactions were not, at the time, illegal. There was no statute against an American Treasury Secretary buying art from the Soviet Union with his personal money. There was also no statute requiring him to disclose what he had done. He did not disclose what he had done. Pausing on this matters because it is the contradiction at the center of the Andrew Mellon biography. It does not resolve. Here is the contradiction. The same Treasury Secretary who was, at that moment, under active federal investigation for tax irregularities involving his own corporations, was simultaneously purchasing confiscated masterpieces from the government of Joseph Stalin with the private intention of donating them to the people of the United States. He did not tell the cabinet. He did not tell the press. He did not put it in any official record. What he disclosed to anyone else is, at this distance, still speculation. I cannot tell you with any honesty whether to admire the act or condemn it. I can tell you that the paintings now hang in the National Gallery of Art in Washington, where roughly 4 million people see them every year, and that the contradiction has not been resolved by their hanging there. The broader Soviet sale program continued for another 3 years, with some paintings going to the Metropolitan Museum in New York and others to the Portuguese oil magnate Calouste Gulbenkian. By 1932, the Hermitage Deputy Director Joseph Orbeli had written directly to Stalin protesting the sale of ancient Persian artifacts. Stalin's reply, dated the autumn of that year, instructed the Foreign Trade Ministry to halt sales of Oriental antiquities. The painting sales wound down by 1934. Across the 4 years of sales, approximately 250 paintings left the Hermitage. The 21 that went to Andrew Mellon were the most significant by any measure of price, fame, or scholarly attention. The Raphael that he acquired for $1,166,400, the Alba Madonna, was the highest price ever paid for a single painting at the time of the sale. On the morning of January 6, 1932, a Texas congressman walked onto the floor of the House of Representatives. Chapter 6. The Impeachment. The Texas congressman was Wright Patman, a Democrat from East Texas in his second term. He stood on the floor of the House of Representatives and delivered the formal words of impeachment against Andrew William Mellon, Secretary of the Treasury of the United States, for high crimes and misdemeanors. The speech ran for about an hour. Patman's catalog was specific. Andrew Mellon held directorships or controlling interests in more than 300 corporations, totaling more than $3 billion in resources. He owned, through corporate subsidiaries, registered sea vessels under 3 foreign flags. Federal law forbade a sitting Treasury Secretary from operating sea vessels in foreign or interstate commerce. The vessels included several tankers operating under the Norwegian flag, others under the Venezuelan flag, and a fleet of Gulf oil vessels operating under the United States flag. Patman further documented that the Bureau of Internal Revenue, which reported to the Treasury Secretary, had issued tax refunds to Mellon-controlled companies on an unusual schedule and at unusual sizes. He cited names. He cited dates. He cited dollar amounts. He closed with a line that became the most quoted summary of the speech. It would, he said, be hard to impeach $1 billion. The Judiciary Committee opened hearings within the week. Mellon's lawyers attempted, and largely succeeded, to limit the scope to the sea vessel question. Mellon himself testified that he had transferred his bank stocks and his industrial directorships to his brother Richard at the time of his confirmation in 1921. The committee determined that this transfer had been incomplete, in fact, that Andrew Mellon had retained beneficial ownership and that he had been in violation of the relevant statute for the duration of his tenure. President Hoover, who had been informed of the committee's direction, intervened. In early February of 1932, Hoover offered Mellon the ambassadorship to the United Kingdom. Mellon accepted. The impeachment proceedings, by structural necessity, were paused. By the time Mellon arrived in London in April, the committee had moved on. The proceedings were never resumed. That was the first ending. The second was longer, slower, and pursued by a different administration. When Franklin Roosevelt took office in March of 1933, he inherited from the Hoover administration a tax investigation against Andrew Mellon that had been underway, in some form, for several years. Roosevelt's Justice Department, with a young Assistant Attorney General named Robert H. Jackson handling the case, sought roughly $3 million in additional taxes and penalties. Jackson would, 2 decades later, sit on the Supreme Court and serve as the chief American prosecutor at the Nuremberg trials. In the spring of 1935, he conducted an extended cross-examination of Andrew Mellon in a Washington hearing room. The case had 2 parts and 2 outcomes. A Pittsburgh grand jury, presented with the criminal portion, declined to indict in 1934. The civil portion ran longer. The Board of Tax Appeals, a body of 15 members across multiple membership changes, took roughly 10,000 pages of testimony and ruled in 1937 that the record did not sustain the charge of fraud. Of 9 disputed transactions, the board found in Mellon's favor on 6. The additional taxes ultimately assessed came to roughly $600,000, a fraction of the $3 million the government had originally sought. The ruling came after Mellon's death. In December of 1936, while the tax case was active, Andrew Mellon wrote a letter to President Roosevelt. The letter offered the people of the United States Mellon's entire art collection, including the 21 Hermitage paintings, along with the funds to construct a National Gallery building on the Mall in Washington. Roosevelt accepted the gift. He also instructed his Treasury team that the prosecution should not be modified or moderated by the offer. Mellon died on August 26, 1937, at his country house in Southampton, New York. He was 82 years old. The architect of the planned gallery building, John Russell Pope, died less than 24 hours later, on August 27th. 2 associates of Pope, Otto Eggers and Daniel P. Higgins, completed the design. The National Gallery of Art was dedicated on the evening of March 17, 1941. President Roosevelt attended. 8,822 guests attended with him. Mellon's son Paul presented the building, the founding collection, and the endowment in his father's name. What the impeachment effort and the tax case actually settled matters here. They settled the legal questions. They did not settle the broader question, which is what a single private fortune sitting inside the federal cabinet of the United States means for the country. That question was deferred. It would resurface a generation later in a magazine office in New York. By 1957, the next generation of Mellons had moved from Pittsburgh boardrooms to the pages of Fortune magazine. Subscribing is how stories like this keep showing up in your feed. It is free. Chapter 7. 4 Cousins. The list appeared in the spring of 1957 in Fortune magazine. It ranked the 8 wealthiest individuals in the United States. Each name was followed by a dollar estimate. 4 of the 8 names shared a surname. They were all first cousins. They were grandchildren of Thomas Mellon, the Pittsburgh judge who had opened a private bank in 1870. They were the children of either Andrew W. Mellon or Richard Beatty Mellon, the 2 brothers who had built the family's industrial empire across the intervening 80 years. Their first names were Paul, Ailsa, Richard King, and Sarah. By 1957, they were somewhere between 50 and 57 years old. Each of them was estimated, by Fortune's research staff, at somewhere between $400 and $700 million. I have spent some time with the magazine itself. In the language of mid-century American business journalism, the four cousins were not, in Fortune's account, an oligarchic anomaly. They were the natural product of a well-functioning system. What is striking, looking at the list from a longer remove, is how completely the four had already diverged from one another in temperament and intention. By 1957, the fortune had been in the family long enough that each branch had developed its own theory of what to do with the money. Paul Mellon, the son of Andrew, was the heir who most resembled his father in habit and bearing. He had been educated at Yale and at Clare College, Cambridge. He had served in the Office of Strategic Services during the Second World War. By 1957, he had already begun what would become a 60-year career of giving in art, education, and conservation. The total of that giving by the time he died in 1999 would approach $1 billion. He commissioned the East Building of the National Gallery from I.M. Pei. He founded the Yale Center for British Art. He donated more than 900 works to the National Gallery directly. He had also, in 1948, married a woman named Rachel Lambert. She was known to everyone as Bunny. Bunny Mellon was the paternal granddaughter of Jordan Wheat Lambert, the St. Louis pharmacist who, in 1879, commercialized the antiseptic Listerine. She was a self-taught horticulturist of unusual obsessiveness, and in 1962, President John F. Kennedy would ask her to redesign the Rose Garden at the White House. She would design it. She would later, in 1965, design the Jacqueline Kennedy Garden on the same grounds. She would arrange the flowers for President Kennedy's funeral. She would remain Jacqueline Kennedy's closest confidant for the next 30 years. Ailsa Mellon Bruce, Andrew's daughter, was by 1957 considered the wealthiest woman in the United States. She had established her Avalon Foundation in 1940. She would bequeath, at her death in 1969, 153 paintings to the National Gallery, along with the acquisition fund that would, 8 years later, purchase Leonardo da Vinci's Ginevra de' Benci for $5 million, then a record price, and still the only painting by Leonardo on public display in the Americas. Her husband David Bruce served as United States ambassador to France, to West Germany, to the United Kingdom, and as the first American emissary to the People's Republic of China. He was the only American ever to hold all three of those post-war European postings. He later served as the United States ambassador to NATO. The arc of his career mapped, roughly, onto the arc of American Cold War diplomacy. Richard King Mellon, the son of Richard Beatty, was the heir who stayed in Pittsburgh. He had risen, in the Army Reserve, to the rank of lieutenant general. He led Mellon Bank for 2 decades. In 1943, he had endorsed a plan for the redevelopment of downtown Pittsburgh and partnered with the city's Democratic mayor, David L. Lawrence, on what became known as the Pittsburgh Renaissance. It was the first privately financed urban redevelopment program of its scale in the United States. It produced the Point State Park, the Gateway Center office towers, the smoke control ordinances that pulled Pittsburgh out of its industrial smog, and the pollution controls that would make the city habitable for a post-war middle class. The Renaissance also cleared approximately 100 acres of the predominantly black Lower Hill District for the construction of the Civic Arena. Approximately 8,000 residents and 400 businesses were displaced. Sarah Mellon Scaife, daughter of Richard Beatty, was the cousin whose philanthropic instinct ran toward medical research. She funded, at the University of Pittsburgh, the laboratory of Jonas Salk. The polio vaccine that Salk announced in April of 1955 had been developed in that laboratory. In 1957, all four were on the same Fortune magazine page. None of them had yet handed control of their respective foundations to the next generation. None of them had yet made the choices that would, in the following 60 years, push the family in directions that would render the four branches, to the public eye, almost unrecognizable to one another. The choices the four cousins made about what to do with the fortune would, across the next 60 years, fan out into nearly every American institution. Chapter 8. The Foundations. Richard Mellon Scaife was the son of Sarah Mellon Scaife, born in 1932. He inherited, in stages across the 1960s and 70s, several $100 million in cash, stock, and beneficial interest in the family's foundations. He was, by any measure of liquid private capital, one of the wealthiest individuals in the country. He was also, until his early 40s, a heavy drinker and an emotionally distant heir. What he did with the fortune, beginning in the late 1960s, was the single most consequential act of political philanthropy of the second half of the American 20th century. Across the next 4 decades, Scaife directed somewhere over $600 million to the construction of what would later be called the conservative movement. He provided early seed funding for the Heritage Foundation in 1973. By 1976, his foundations alone were supplying around 42% of Heritage's annual budget. He served as vice chair of the board. He funded the Hoover Institution, the American Enterprise Institute, and the Federalist Society. He funded the American Spectator's Arkansas Project, the multi-year investigative effort into Bill Clinton's gubernatorial conduct. He owned the Pittsburgh Tribune-Review, which lost approximately $244 million between 1992 and 2007, losses Scaife covered out of personal funds. The paper's editorial line, across that period, advanced the theory that the 1993 death of Bill Clinton's deputy White House counsel, Vince Foster, had not been a suicide. It was this body of work that Hillary Clinton, in 1998, characterized as part of a vast right-wing conspiracy. Scaife achieved sobriety in 1990 and died in 2014. His sister was Cordelia Scaife May. She had been born in 1928. Her life took a different shape. She married, in 1949, a Pittsburgh man named Robert Duggan, who rose to become the elected district attorney of Allegheny County and the target, by 1974, of a federal racketeering investigation. On the morning of March 5, 1974, hours before he was scheduled to be indicted, Duggan was found in his car with a fatal gunshot wound. The death was ruled a suicide. Cordelia, who had been estranged from her brother since the previous year, withdrew from public life. She lived for the next 31 years as a recluse on a Westmoreland County estate. She funded, with most of her personal fortune, an organization called the Colcom Foundation. Colcom existed for the purpose of restricting immigration to the United States. In the late 1970s, Cordelia had become a personal friend and funder of John Tanton, the Michigan ophthalmologist who, in 1979, founded the Federation for American Immigration Reform. The founding executive director of FAIR, Roger Connor, would later tell the New York Times that without Cordelia's money, there would have been no organization. She funded FAIR from its inception. She funded the Center for Immigration Studies. She funded Numbers USA. She bequeathed approximately $400 million to Colcom on her death in 2005. By 2019, Colcom had directed more than $180 million to immigration restriction organizations. There was a figure of an older generation whose money entered the same era from a different direction. Her name was Bunny Mellon. She had designed the Rose Garden. She had been Jacqueline Kennedy's closest confidant. In 2007 and 2008, when she was 96 and then 97, she wrote a series of personal checks totaling more than $700,000 to a senior aide of the presidential candidate, John Edwards. The funds were used to support a woman with whom Edwards had fathered a child during his wife's terminal cancer treatment. Bunny Mellon's role in the transactions did not become public until the federal investigation that followed Edwards's nomination collapse. She was not charged. She maintained in her remaining years that she had not understood the purpose. She died in 2014 at the age of 103. There was a figure in the same generation who took the fortune in a direction entirely different. His name was William Larimer Mellon, Jr. He was 37 years old when he read a Life magazine article about Albert Schweitzer, who had been operating a hospital for the rural poor in Gabon. He wrote to Schweitzer. The correspondence ran for years. He enrolled in Tulane Medical School. He graduated. He moved with his wife Gwen to the Artibonite Valley of central Haiti. On June 26, 1956, the Hôpital Albert Schweitzer Haiti opened with 80 beds. He ran the hospital for the next 33 years. An heir emerged later. His name was Timothy Mellon. He was Paul Mellon's only son. He spent most of his working life running the Pan American Railways system in northern New England. In 2022, he sold the railroad to CSX for approximately $600 million. Beginning in 2020, he emerged as the single largest disclosed individual donor to Republican federal campaigns. He gave roughly $60 million in 2020, $47 million in 2022, approximately $165 million across the 2024 cycle, with a $50 million check to a Trump-aligned political action committee in May of that year, $53 million in stock to a Texas border wall effort, and $130 million anonymously in October of 2025 to pay the salaries of United States troops during a federal government shutdown. The New York Times identified him as the donor 2 days after the check was issued. What it does to American political infrastructure when one family fortune funds the conservative movement, the immigration restriction movement, a Haitian hospital, and a presidential candidate's affair, all in a single generation, is a question the available evidence does not, in the end, settle. It is also the question that none of these heirs, by my reading of the available correspondence, ever sat down and asked themselves directly. There was one more. He chose none of those paths. He chose, instead, cryptocurrency and a series of marriages and a long fight with addiction. If you are still watching, you are who I make these for. Subscribe, and I will keep making them. Chapter 9. Matthew. His name was Matthew Mellon II. He was born in 1964. He was an heir to the same family fortune that had built the bank in 1870, the National Gallery, and the political apparatus described in the previous chapter. He inherited, by the public accounts that have entered the record, approximately $25 million in his early adulthood. His acknowledged opioid addiction ran for most of his adult life. He spoke about it openly in interviews. He completed multiple treatment programs and relapsed from each. The money could pay for the programs. It could not produce the will to complete them. In the late 1990s, he met a British fashion executive named Tamara Yurdai. She had co-founded, 2 years earlier, the luxury footwear brand Jimmy Choo. The brand became one of the most recognized luxury labels of the early 2000s. He married her in 2000. The marriage did not survive the company. They divorced in 2005. He came back to New York. He served, beginning in the late 2000s, as the finance chairman of the New York Republican State Committee. He remarried, this time to a woman named Nicole Hanley. he continued to use opioids, including, by his own acknowledgement in interviews given in the months before he died, periods of consumption that, in any clinical assessment, were severe. In 2014, he was introduced to a new cryptocurrency called XRP. The cryptocurrency was being issued by a San Francisco company called Ripple Labs. It traded at the time for fractions of a cent. Matthew Mellon invested approximately $2 million. By early January of 2018, XRP had risen more than 500-fold from his entry point. His holding at the peak was reportedly worth somewhere over $1 billion. Pausing here matters, because what happened next is the part of the story that most resembles the older Mellon contradictions and the part that most departs from them. Most of the family's earlier wealth had been built in legible forms: bank shares, industrial equities, real estate. Each could be valued, taxed, and transferred. The Mellons had taken pains, across 5 generations, to keep the family's holdings within institutional structures that allowed for orderly succession. XRP was different. XRP existed as a series of cryptographic entries on a public ledger maintained by computers around the world. To move it, you needed the keys. To prove you owned it, you needed the keys. To leave it to anyone, you needed to deliver the keys to someone you trusted. Matthew Mellon had told reporters on the record in interviews in late 2017 and early 2018 that he had not given the keys to anyone. He had said this with what the reporters described as a kind of pride. The keys, he said, were in his head, on his laptop, and on a small number of physical devices in storage units and houses he owned. He was using opioids again at the time of those interviews. There is a particular psychology to holding a position of this kind that bears describing, because it accounts for some of what happened. When a holding moves from $1 million to $10 million to $100 million to $1 billion in the space of 18 months, the holder begins to lose access to the kind of judgment that ordinary financial decisions require. The amount becomes uncountable. The decision to sell or hold becomes a decision about identity rather than a decision about asset allocation. Matthew Mellon had spent his adult life trying to construct an identity that did not depend on the Mellon name. The XRP position appeared, by some of his own statements, to provide that identity. He had made the money. It was his money. It was not, in his telling, the family's money. In March of 2018, he made a decision that was, in the context of his addiction history, the kind of decision he had made before. He was going to detox. The treatment he had selected was a course of ibogaine, the West African plant alkaloid that some published studies suggested could interrupt opioid dependency in a single session. Ibogaine is illegal in the United States. The treatment is administered in clinics outside the country. He booked himself into a clinic outside Cancun for the 3rd week of April. On April 12th, he and Nicole Hanley flew to Cancun. They checked into a hotel. He had been using opioids again in the days before the trip. On the morning of April 14th, he was found in the hotel room. The cause of death was a heart attack. He was 54 years old. Chapter 10. The Keys. The hotel room was sealed by Mexican authorities for several days. The body was returned to the United States. The funeral was private. The estate began almost immediately the process of trying to reconstruct what Matthew Mellon had owned. The XRP holding was the central problem. The Mellon estate retained forensic specialists, cryptocurrency consultants, and the family office's general counsel. Across the next 2 years, they were able to locate and access a portion of the holding, by the best public accounting available through tax court filings, of approximately $150 million. The Internal Revenue Service, which had taxed the estate on the value of the full holding at the time of death, issued a deficiency notice for $36 million. The estate spent years negotiating the obligation against the recovered assets. The negotiation eventually settled. The remainder of the holding, by all available evidence, is still in the wallet. The keys have not been found. The family that Matthew Mellon belonged to was not, in any institutional sense, diminished by his death. The Andrew W. Mellon Foundation, formed in 1969 by merging Paul Mellon's Old Dominion Foundation with Ailsa Mellon Bruce's Avalon Foundation, held an endowment of approximately $7.7 billion at the end of 2024. The foundation issued roughly 650 grants in that year, totaling about $540 million, primarily in the arts and humanities. The National Gallery of Art continues to operate. The 4 million annual visitors continue to walk past Raphael's Alba Madonna in the West Building. Forbes, in 2024, estimated the combined net worth of the living members of the Mellon family at approximately $14.1 billion. The estimate placed the family at number 34 on the magazine's list of America's richest families. The fortune had by then dispersed across more than 200 living descendants of Thomas Mellon, the great majority of whom had no operational role in the firms or institutions their ancestors had built. The bank itself had been merged in 2007 with the Bank of New York. The combined firm, BNY Mellon, operated as the largest custodian bank in the world. In October of 2025, during the federal government shutdown that began in the early autumn, an anonymous donor wrote a check to the Department of Defense for $130 million. The funds were earmarked to cover the salaries of United States troops who were not being paid. President Trump publicly thanked the donor without naming him. The New York Times identified him 2 days later as Timothy Mellon, the same heir who had given $165 million to the Trump campaign in the previous year. Forbes would later calculate that Timothy Mellon's cumulative federal political giving since 2020 exceeded $500 million, making him, on the available evidence, the single largest individual donor in the history of American federal campaign finance. He is, on the public record, a great-great-grandson of Judge Thomas Mellon, the same Pittsburgh banker who, in 1871, approved a $10,000 loan to a 21-year-old coke maker named Henry Clay Frick. I want to step back from the chronology now. The historical tour is complete. It would be easy to read the story as a morality tale. The dynasty rises, the dynasty corrupts. The dynasty produces an heir who cannot survive his own inheritance, and the inheritance, having killed him, continues to compound. That is not what this story is. The Mellons were not, on the available evidence, more rapacious than the other industrial dynasties of their period. They were not more corrupt. They were not more or less personally tragic than the Vanderbilts or the Rockefellers or the DuPonts. What strikes me, having spent the time I have spent with this material, is the impersonality of the configuration. Andrew Mellon did not particularly enjoy his fortune. Paul did not particularly enjoy his fortune. Matthew, by all accounts, did not particularly enjoy his fortune. The fortune was not, in the end, optimized for the enjoyment of the people who held it. It was optimized for its own continuation. The 5 generations were the substrate. The fortune was the organism, what survived. The bank, in altered form, as BNY Mellon, custodian of trillions of dollars in client assets, the National Gallery of Art, the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation, the Mellon Institute, now folded into Carnegie Mellon University, the Hôpital Albert Schweitzer, Haiti, still operating in the Artibonite Valley, the Yale Center for British Art, the White House Rose Garden in altered form. What did not survive? Andrew W. Mellon, who is buried in Pittsburgh. Paul, in Virginia. Bunny, in Virginia. Matthew, in the United States. The cryptographic keys to his wallet. The hotel room is on the Mayan Riviera, south of Cancun, on the strip of resort coastline that runs from the airport down toward Tulum. The 54-year-old man who was found dead there on the morning of April 14, 2018, was named Matthew Mellon. He had been due to enter an experimental drug treatment program the morning after. He did not get out of the room. On his laptop was a cryptocurrency wallet whose keys are still, by all public accounts, unrecovered. The room has been re-rented in the years since. The hotel has changed ownership at least once. The wallet, on the public ledger, can be observed from any computer with an internet connection. It still holds, by current exchange rates, several $100 million in XRP. It has not moved. The fortune persists. The man at the end of the inheritance does not. This is what this channel is for. Subscribe, and I will see you on the next one.